You wake up, stretch, and check your phone. Maybe someone posted a meme or your Wi-Fi's down. Normal human problems. But then your phone vibrates again. Emergency alert. The notification has nothing to do with heavy rain or traffic. It reads, nuclear missiles inbound. Most wars give you time to panic or organize. A nuclear attack provides only enough time to regret. This scenario has moved from theory to reality dozens of times. Paranoid generals, technical glitches, and even a training tape inserted into the wrong machine have all pushed the planet toward an accidental countdown. Nuclear weapons changed the nature of warfare. Strategy shifted from counting dead soldiers to measuring how many minutes it takes to erase an entire city. These weapons work by releasing the energy stored inside atoms. When heavy atoms split apart, fission, or tiny ones combine, fusion, matter itself is converted into a massive explosion. In 1945, humanity proved it could build an artificial sun and drop it on a living city. The temperature at the center of the Hiroshima blast was hotter than the surface of the sun. Buildings vanished. People kilometers away suffered lethal burns from the light itself. The devastation at Hiroshima ended a world war, but it trapped every future generation in a psychological hostage situation. After 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union viewed every defensive move by the other as a direct threat. This suspicion created a loop where neither side felt safe unless they were constantly expanding their arsenal. This led to competitive overkill. By the 1960s, both superpowers had enough weapons to destroy human civilizations several times over. Military leaders adopted a strategy called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was horrifyingly simple. If one side attacks, the other matches that move before dying. Peace is maintained because launching an attack is effectively a suicide note, like two people pointing flamethrowers at each other while standing in gasoline. This balance only holds if detection systems work perfectly and leaders remain entirely rational. If a single computer malfunctions or a politician panics, the strategy collapses. For decades, global stability relied on duct-taping grenades to two superpowers and hoping nobody tripped. Both nations feared a surprise attack could wipe out their missiles on the ground. To prevent this, they built the nuclear triad, 3 redundant systems designed to survive any first strike. The first 2 prongs are land-based missiles buried in underground silos and submarines hiding in the deep ocean. The final prong involves strategic bombers, like this B-52, kept in a constant state of readiness to launch from the sky. This interconnected system means that even if an enemy destroys the silos and airfields, the submarines can still deliver a retaliatory strike. By making the retaliation system unkillable, humanity engineered a doomsday machine that could never be turned off. Intercontinental ballistic missiles move so fast, a leader might have less than 15 minutes to decide if the world is ending. This unimaginable pressure forces military officers to make life or death decisions while staring at primitive radar strains, easily fooled by computer errors or atmospheric interference. This existential dread shaped the psychology of entire generations. Children were taught that if a city was vaporized, they should politely crouch beneath their desks for safety. The entire system prioritized speed over verification. This meant a single faulty wire or a broken computer chip had the authority to accidentally trigger the end of civilization. While the computers were programmed for immediate response, the humans monitoring them were prone to exhaustion, fear, and hesitation. In high-stakes command centers, the demand for a rapid launch often stripped human operators of the time they needed to think. When the system signaled an incoming attack, the survival of the human species depended on whether the person in the room chose to believe the machine. This created a recurring theme in Cold War history. When technical systems failed, civilization relied on individual doubt to keep the peace. These are the stories of the moments when that. The year was 1948, and Europe was a landscape of rebuilding cities and fresh graves. World War II had ended only a few years earlier, and humanity had barely begun to process the horror of the atomic bomb. Yet the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already collapsing into a state of quiet suspicion. Distrust transformed into global paranoia, leaving America in a unique and unstable position. They held a total monopoly on nuclear weapons. At the center of this tension was Berlin. The city sat deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany, but its western sectors were controlled by the United States and its allies. It was a geopolitical absurdity, roughly equivalent to your enemy owning half of your apartment. In 1948, the Soviets blocked all land access to West Berlin. They cut off the roads and railways, attempting to starve the city into submission. This standoff set a dangerous precedent for the nuclear age. Because there was no established rulebook for atomic diplomacy, the United States had to improvise its response in real time, never certain where the Soviet red lines actually were. American leaders were caught between two extremes. They could back down and grant the Soviets a massive political victory, or they could use force to break the blockade and risk a military confrontation that neither side fully understood. They chose an unprecedented logistical workaround, the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, thousands of planes flew supplies into the city non-stop. Food, coal, and medicine arrived by air for over 2 million people. From the ground, starving civilians watched as supply planes landed every few minutes. Every flight was a lifeline, but every flight was also a gamble. If a single Soviet pilot had shot down a cargo plane, no one knew what the retaliation would look like. The danger of the Cold War wasn't just the weapons themselves, but the total uncertainty of how a single spark would trigger a nuclear response. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb. The American monopoly was over. Now both superpowers possessed civilization-ending weapons, transforming the nature of global conflict. This shift turned military planning into a cold, bureaucratic exercise. Generals began calculating acceptable casualties, producing paperwork that estimated how many millions of deaths a nation could endure and still function. As the arms race accelerated, scientists moved from atomic fission to fusion, creating the hydrogen bomb. The leap in power was staggering, roughly the difference between a hand grenade and a meteor. During the first American hydrogen bomb test in the year 1952, the resulting explosion literally erased an island from the map. It was proof that humanity had developed the power to reshape the geography of the planet. When the Soviets tested their own fusion weapon, both superpower nations became trapped in a never-ending cycle of escalating paranoia. Fear of falling behind justified massive military expansion, as leaders became obsessed with gaps in technology and missile counts that often existed only in their own intelligence reports. To ensure they could strike back if their airfields were destroyed, the United States kept nuclear-armed bombers in the sky at all times. Some of these planes stayed airborne 24 hours a day, circling the globe with enough firepower to end modern society. Keeping live nuclear weapons in the sky created a new category of risk, the broken arrow. This was the military's term for accidental nuclear incidents, ranging from minor malfunctions to human beings literally misplacing atomic bombs. In 1958, an American bomber crew flying over the state of Georgia accidentally released a nuclear weapon during a sudden mid-air emergency. The bomb hit the ground, and its conventional explosives detonated, leaving a massive crater behind. An even more terrifying incident occurred in 1961 over North Carolina. A B-52 bomber broke apart mid-air, and as one of its hydrogen bombs fell, it automatically went through its arming sequence. It reached the final stages of detonation while still in the air. Analysis later revealed that a single low-voltage switch was the only thing that prevented a thermonuclear explosion on American soil. Human civilization continued because a tiny electrical component functioned exactly as intended. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 terrified America because it undeniably proved that the Soviets had mastered long-range rocket technology. If they could put a satellite in orbit, they could successfully launch a nuclear warhead into a city across the ocean. Ballistic missiles changed the timeline of war. While bombers took hours to reach their targets, missiles arrived in minutes. This compressed the window for human decision-making so severely that there was almost no time left to even think. To catch these missiles in time, the U.S. built massive radar stations across the Arctic. These systems were designed to monitor the skies 24/7, searching for any sign of a launch. This hair-trigger environment led to a strategy called launch on warning. It meant that if a radar screen suddenly showed incoming missiles, a country might immediately launch its own nuclear retaliation based purely on that electronic interpretation before a single explosion was ever confirmed. While the military secretly built these automated systems of doom, the general public lived in a state of normalized madness. Families built fallout shelters in their yards and stored canned food underground, adapting to the idea that their world could evaporate at any moment. People still dated, went to work, and complained about the weather, all while generations psychologically adjusted to the possibility of extinction. It was an incredible demonstration of the human ability to treat the impossible as mundane. In a system where reaction times were measured in minutes, the internal logic of the machine began to outweigh the intent of the leaders. A simple military exercise or a defensive movement could be interpreted by an opponent as the first move of an invasion, triggering a cycle of escalation that neither side could stop. This cycle reached its peak following the Cuban Revolution. When Fidel Castro aligned his government with the Soviet Union, the geopolitical landscape shifted overnight. For American leaders, the threat was now visceral. Cuba sat just 90 miles from Florida. The enemy was no longer across an ocean. They were in the neighboring yard. After the CIA-backed Bayes-Pigs invasion ended in a disastrous failure, Castro and the Soviets became convinced that a full-scale American invasion was imminent. In response to that perceived threat, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev secretly moved nuclear missiles onto the island. When American reconnaissance planes finally spotted the launch sites and fuel trailers, the reality of the situation became clear. The automated, hair-triggered doomsday machine humanity had spent a decade building was now sitting 90 miles from the American coast. The discovery of those missiles plunged the world into the 13 most terrifying days. In October 1962, most people lived their lives with no idea how close they were to extinction. While kids sat in classrooms and families watched television, the most powerful governments on Earth were finalizing the paperwork for nuclear war. The strategy was driven by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. He was a man of loud theatrics, once famously banging his shoe on a table at the United Nations, but those public outbursts masked a very real strategic panic. From his perspective, the Soviet Union was being surrounded. American nuclear missiles were already stationed in Turkey and Italy, and American bombers circled his territory constantly. Khrushchev's solution was a gamble of extreme proportions. He would secretly move his own nuclear arsenal into Cuba, positioning a massive strike force just 90 miles from the United States. By the time the final transport ships arrived, the Soviet Union had effectively placed a loaded weapon against the head of the American government, without a single U.S. intelligence agency detecting the movement. That silence ended on October 14th, when an American U-2 spy plane flew a high-altitude mission over the Cuban interior. This photograph provided the first undeniable proof of what was happening on the ground. These labels identify actual Soviet nuclear launch facilities under construction, including missile erectors and shelter tents. President John F. Kennedy now faced an impossible calculation. If he did nothing, the Soviet Union gained a permanent nuclear advantage on his doorstep. But if he attacked, he risked triggering a full Soviet retaliation. These images instantly turned a regional dispute into a potential final countdown for human civilization. Inside secret XCOM meetings, the pressure was suffocating. Military leaders demanded immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles before they became operational, while advisors warned that any American attack would force Khrushchev to escalate. Kennedy chose a middle path, a naval blockade to stop any further shipments. However, since a blockade is legally an act of war, the White House officially termed it a quarantine, hoping that a change in vocabulary might prevent a world-ending conflict. When Kennedy addressed the nation on television, the public mood shifted instantly from normalcy to existential dread. People crowded into grocery stores for canned food and retreated into backyard shelters, waiting for the first flashes of light. Behind the scenes, the military moved to DEFCON 2. This is the only time the United States has ever reached a readiness state just one step away from full-scale nuclear combat. At this level of alert, nuclear-armed bombers remained airborne and missile crews sat waiting for launch codes, creating a state of high-speed readiness where a single miscommunication could trigger a launch. While the world watched the surface fleets, the most dangerous moment of the crisis was happening deep underwater. The Soviet submarine B-59 was isolated, sweltering in extreme heat, and completely cut off from communication with Moscow. Above them, American naval ships began dropping practice depth charges. The Americans intended these as signals for the submarine to surface, but the crew below had no way to know that. Feeling the hull rattle from explosions, the Soviet officers believed war had already begun. They were trapped in a steel tube with a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo and no information from the world above. Launching that torpedo required the agreement of 3 senior officers. 2 of them, convinced that their country was already under attack, gave their approval to fire. The 3rd officer was Vasily Arkhipov. He refused to authorize the launch, arguing with the other officers until they agreed to surface the submarine instead of firing the weapon. Arkhipov's refusal to authorize the strike broke the protocol. The submarine surfaced instead of firing, leaving the continuation of human history in the hands of a single officer who chose to doubt the systems surrounding him. This iceberg graphic illustrates the massive difference between American intelligence and the reality on the ground. Below the surface, out of view of the spy planes, were 40,000 Soviet troops and dozens of operational tactical nuclear weapons. If Kennedy had ordered the invasion his generals were demanding, local commanders in Cuba were authorized to use those tactical nukes against the landing forces, almost certainly triggering a global exchange. A final secret compromise ended the standoff. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, while America privately promised to remove its own missiles from Turkey later on, allowing both sides to step back from the edge. The realization of how close they had come to an accidental war led to the creation of the Washington-Moscow hotline. These teletype machines were installed to ensure that in a future crisis, leaders wouldn't have to rely on guesswork and delayed telegrams. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught the world that human survival isn't just a matter of avoiding bad intentions. It is a matter of managing the inevitable failures of communication, the limits of our own information, and the terrifying speed of the systems we built. We came incredibly close to wiping ourselves out in 1962. You'd think the Cuban Missile Crisis would serve as the ultimate wake-up call, a moment where both superpowers stepped back from the brink and agreed to turn down the temperature. But that didn't happen. The weapons stayed, the paranoia stayed. And to try and manage that fear, militaries introduced automated early warning systems. Suddenly, the responsibility of watching the skies shifted to machines. Both the US and the Soviets built massive interconnected networks of radar stations and satellites, stretching to the most remote corners of the globe, constantly watching for any sign of a launch. This meant global security now relied heavily on the processing power of early Cold War computers, huge rooms filled with massive cabinets and spinning magnetic tape. And those machines had a very specific, terrifying flaw. They malfunctioned. A lot. By trying to remove human hesitation from the equation, military leaders tied the survival of civilization directly to the flawless operation of incredibly primitive electronics. They inadvertently built the perfect machinery for an accidental apocalypse. To understand why a computer glitch was so dangerous, we have to look at how fragile global politics actually were. Take the 1967 Six-Day War in the Middle East. At first glance, a localized conventional conflict shouldn't threaten global survival, but the US and the USSR heavily backed opposing sides. When Soviet intelligence reportedly passed incorrect military information to Egypt, tensions spiked. Suddenly, a regional conflict caused both superpowers to quietly prepare their airborne, naval, and nuclear forces for action. This hyper-connected paranoia gave rise to one of the most stressful military doctrines ever conceived, launch on warning, often summarized as use it or lose it. The logic was brutally simple. Waiting for an enemy warhead to hit your territory to confirm an attack meant those weapons would destroy your own missiles in their silos. Therefore, leaders had only minutes to authorize retaliation while enemy weapons were still airborne. With that extreme time pressure, a warning blip on a radar screen wasn't an issue to investigate. It was an immediate call to action. Any technological error could easily cross the threshold into full-blown nuclear escalation. That exact scenario played out on the morning of November 9, 1979. Deep inside NORAD, the Defense Command Center tasked with protecting North America, monitoring screens suddenly displayed the worst possible data. A massive, full-scale Soviet nuclear strike was underway. The military response was immediate. Across the country, missile crews entered high alert status, and massive strategic bombers violently spun up their engines to scramble onto the runways. But as adrenaline flooded the command centers, officers noticed a strange contradiction. The computer network screamed that hundreds of missiles were incoming, but the physical radar systems staring directly into the sky showed absolutely empty airspace. After several terrifying minutes, they traced the source of the attack. It wasn't the Soviets. A technician had accidentally loaded a highly realistic simulation training tape directly into the live operational computer network. The machine simply played the tape. The real danger of this mistake lies in the reaction. The Soviet Union watched American military movements closely. If they detected U.S. bombers suddenly scrambling, they might assume an American attack was starting and launch a real preemptive strike in response. One side reacting to a glitch could easily terrify the other side into pulling the trigger. Barely 6 months later, in June 1980, the warning systems triggered again. American screens flashed warnings of incoming Soviet missiles, but this time the numbers wildly fluctuated. 1 second it was 2 missiles, the next it was 200. Just like before, the lack of immediate radar confirmation didn't stop the panic. Command centers initiated emergency procedures, bomber crews rushed to their aircraft, and the military prepared for the end of the world. When investigators finally dug into the hardware, they found the culprit generating the phantom apocalypse. It was a single faulty computer chip, one tiny electronic component failing inside a communications network. The fate of human civilization briefly hinged on a cheap, mass-produced piece of circuitry. The systems built to ensure our survival were demonstrably fragile, and we kept trusting them anyway. The timing for these glitches was terrible because the political climate was rapidly deteriorating. By 1983, the rhetoric between the superpowers was exceptionally hostile. The United States aggressively increased military spending, and President Ronald Reagan publicly branded the Soviet Union the evil empire. Inside the USSR, leadership grew intensely suspicious. High-ranking Soviet commanders analyzed the aggressive new American weapons and genuinely believed the U.S. was laying the groundwork for a sudden, decapitating first strike. This fear reached a boiling point during Able Archer 83, a massive NATO military exercise in Europe. The simulation was so detailed and realistic that Soviet intelligence agencies concluded it might actually be a cover story to disguise a real invasion. The global tension was wound incredibly tight. The automated defense network was a loaded gun with a hair trigger, operating in an environment where leaders were already expecting an attack to happen at any moment. It was in this exact atmosphere, on the night of September 26, 1983, that the Soviet warning network suddenly blared to life. Alarms triggered inside a command bunker near Moscow. The computer explicitly indicated an American missile had launched, then another, until 5 incoming warheads registered on the screen. The officer on duty was Stanislav Petrov. His orders were absolute. If the system detected an attack, he was required to report it up the chain of command immediately. Given the immense paranoia of the Soviet leadership at that exact moment, a warning from Petrov would almost certainly result in a massive nuclear retaliation. He had minutes to decide whether to start World War III. But as the alarms screamed, Petrov hesitated. He reasoned that if the United States were actually launching a preemptive first strike, they would send hundreds of missiles to cripple the Soviet Union, not just 5. Trusting his intuition, Petrov declared the alert a system malfunction. And he was right. Weeks later, engineers discovered the satellite sensors had been tricked by a rare environmental anomaly. Sunlight had reflected off high-altitude clouds at exactly the right angle, perfectly mimicking the thermal signature of a missile launch. For decades, humanity poured its resources and scientific genius into building vast, automated systems designed to execute war perfectly. Yet the only reason we are still here is because, in the crucial moment, an exhausted officer had the uniquely human. For decades, the public narrative of the Cold War centered on the stability of mutual assured destruction. We were told that the threat of total annihilation created a world of tightly controlled, perfectly rational standoffs. In November 1983, a NATO training exercise called Able Archer pushed the world to the edge of total nuclear war. Able Archer involved actual troop movements across Europe, shifting aircraft, and simulated procedures for a full-scale nuclear release. From the Soviet perspective, these maneuvers looked like the final preparations for a surprise first strike. Soviet intelligence watched the exercise and concluded that a real war had begun. Civilization nearly collapsed because a routine drill was indistinguishable from an act of war. Our survival systems were far more fragile than the strategists ever admitted. Soviet panic was rooted in the permanent trauma of 1941, when Nazi Germany launched a devastating surprise invasion that the Soviet leadership failed to predict. That historical scar wired Soviet strategic thinking to assume that any Western military activity was likely a deceptive cover for a hidden attack. When NATO launched its realistic drill, Moscow responded by readying its own nuclear-capable bombers for an immediate retaliatory strike. Throughout the crisis, NATO officials remained largely unaware of the terror they had triggered, viewing their own actions as entirely routine. It took years for Western leaders to realize that the Soviets weren't posturing. President Ronald Reagan eventually understood that in a nuclear standoff, a neighbor's fear is just as dangerous as their aggression. This atmosphere of high-stakes guesswork extended deep underwater, where nuclear submarines hide a nation's most destructive weapons. Communication is notoriously difficult beneath the waves. If a crew loses radio contact during a period of high tension, they are left to wonder if their country has already been destroyed. Crews lived through long months of claustrophobic isolation, constantly stalking and being actively stalked by enemy vessels in total silence. The pressure was so intense that American and Soviet submarines occasionally crashed directly into each other in the dark, risking an accidental escalation that no one on the surface could stop. These collisions demonstrate that the Cold War wasn't a series of isolated events, but a continuous state of danger where luck was the primary safety mechanism. Inside NORAD command centers, personnel carried the psychological burden of monitoring the skies around the clock, waiting for signals that might mean the end of the world. They relied on massive radar structures to interpret data, searching for any anomaly that could indicate an incoming missile flight. Frequent malfunctions of early warning systems forced operators to balance system trust against human skepticism. If the balance leans too far toward skepticism, a real attack might be ignored. If it leans toward absolute trust, a computer glitch could start a war. To solve for human doubt, the Soviet Union developed Dead Hand, a system designed to ensure automatic nuclear retaliation even if the nation's leadership was decapitated. The logic of deterrence eventually reached a point where we researched how to automate the apocalypse, ensuring the machines would continue the war after we were gone. The systems we built failed repeatedly. Computers glitched, training exercises caused panic, and nuclear submarines collided blindly in the dark. We survived because individuals like Stanislav Petrov refused to trust the data their machines provided, choosing to doubt the alarm rather than launch a strike. Deterrence theories are built on the assumption of calculated, rational responses, yet our survival often came from something far less predictable: the human capacity for doubt. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the political tensions of the Cold War seemed to vanish overnight. But the missiles, the bombers, and the automated launch systems were never dismantled. The physical infrastructure of the nuclear age is still active today. We did not solve the problem of accidental apocalypse, we merely inherited it. The close calls of the past remain active warnings that our world still balances on a... Look at this photo. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, the world exhaled. People celebrated in the streets, and for a while we genuinely thought the standoff was over. We started treating the apocalypse like ancient history. But those weapons didn't vanish. They simply went quiet. We still share this planet with thousands of nuclear warheads, enough material to erase human civilization several times over. The physical danger never passed. It just slipped out of our daily conversations. Psychologists call this normalcy bias. Our brains evolved to react to immediate, visible threats, like a predator or a storm, not the abstract concept of global annihilation. When a threat stops making us feel emotional panic, we eventually ignore it completely. So we go about our normal lives. We commute, scroll through our phones, watch movies, and argue online, completely disconnected from the fact that massive networks of world-ending machinery are sitting silently underground, right beneath our feet. This image shows the reality we choose to forget. That lack of public fear is actually a severe vulnerability. We have normalized living alongside civilization-ending weapons that remain fully active and ready, entirely out of sight and out of mind. During the Cold War, the nuclear standoff was relatively straightforward, a high-stakes game between two massive superpowers. Today, that landscape has fractured. We now have 9 different nations armed with nuclear capabilities. This map highlights those 9 states and the intricate web of adversarial relationships between them. Each of these countries operate with different political systems, different command structures, and deeply rooted regional fears. As you add more players to an interconnected system, the mathematical probability of miscalculation multiplies. Now, add speed to that equation. Modern delivery systems, particularly emerging hypersonic weapons, travel exponentially faster than older technology. An incoming strike can cross the globe in a fraction of the time it took during the 20th century. This creates a terrifying biological bottleneck. Human leaders may soon have only a handful of minutes to decide if an incoming threat warning is real. We struggle to pick a toothpaste brand under pressure, yet we are forcing leaders to make civilization-ending choices before their morning coffee finishes brewing. When you combine a tangled global web of paranoid actors with hypersonic delivery systems, the modern nuclear architecture is structurally engineered to force a catastrophic split-second human error. Take a look at this radar installation. Decades ago, early warning systems like this were mostly standalone, physical machines. Today, our military detection relies heavily on deeply interconnected digital infrastructure, and interconnected systems are vulnerable systems. Hackers now possess the tools to infiltrate military networks, disrupt global communications, and intentionally spoof radar to create fake missile launch signals. The most dangerous variable in a cyber attack is attribution. If a nation's early warning screens suddenly light up with launch indicators, they might not know if the attack is coming from a rival superpower, a rogue hacker, or a terrorist organization trying to spark a war. This visualization shows the risk of inviting artificial intelligence into the command room. As militaries integrate machine learning for threat detection, the danger of an algorithm misinterpreting unusual data and recommending escalation faster than human comprehension grows rapidly. The logic of nuclear deterrence requires knowing exactly who is attacking you and having the clarity to respond. Injecting cyber vulnerabilities and AI automation strips away that certainty, leaving only chaos in its place. This border pate separates India and Pakistan. The global threat no longer rests solely with major superpowers. These two nations share a heavily militarized border, a long history of conflict, and active nuclear arsenals maintained in a constant state of high readiness. As this diagram illustrates, even a localized nuclear exchange between regional powers would have severe planetary consequences. The resulting firestorms would inject immense volumes of smoke into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight, freezing crops, and collapsing the global food supply. We also face the distinct challenge of isolated regimes, as seen in this North Korean military parade. When you combine nuclear capability with extreme isolation, aggressive rhetoric, and incredibly poor diplomatic communication channels, the room for a tragic misunderstanding expands rapidly. The safety of the entire planet is no longer dictated by two capitals in Washington and Moscow. It is deeply tied to the unpredictable behaviors and localized panics of scattered, decentralized actors. Pop culture trains us to imagine a nuclear war starting with an evil mastermind deliberately pressing a red button. But history shows us a very different reality. The true catalyst for disaster is an uncontrollable chain reaction, a misunderstood training exercise, a glitch in a computer chip, a breakdown in radio communication. It is the slow, steady drip of human error escalating wildly out of control. Think about the aviation industry. Even with some of the most rigorous, double-checked engineering on Earth, commercial planes occasionally crash because complex technological systems inevitably experience failure. We like to believe our governments have perfectly managed the nuclear threat through brilliant diplomatic strategy. The reality is far less comforting. We have survived repeated systemic breakdowns largely due to sheer, uncomfortable luck. During the most terrifying close calls of the last 70 years, disaster was averted because individual humans actively questioned the faulty data their machines presented to them. Technology has built the machinery for rapid annihilation, but machines lack the capacity to weigh the moral cost of their calculations. Only a human being can decide to hesitate. The entire complex web of global survival hangs by a single fragile thread, the hope that the next tired operator, sitting alone in the dark, will choose caution over catastrophe when the warning light. We wake up, commute, and grab our coffee, under the assumption that tomorrow will look exactly like today. But if the world suddenly stops, you realize how incredibly fragile this routine actually is. Astrophysicists often discuss the Great Filter, a statistical concept explaining why the universe seems so empty. The math suggests that developing civilizations almost inevitably hit a barrier that wipes them out before they can expand. Survival, statistically speaking, is the exception. For most of human history, that filter was biology and climate. Localized near extinctions were common. Pathogens like the bubonic plague rapidly wiped out up to half the population of Europe, leaving millions dead before medicine could even identify the cause. That dynamic shifted completely in the mid-20th century. With the successful detonation of the first atomic bomb, humanity took control of its own extinction. The primary threat moved from nature to our own engineering. We survived the Cold War, but our continued existence has absolutely nothing to do with airtight security or infallible technology. The historical record shows we made it through relying almost entirely on sheer luck and desperate split-second human decisions. Because our survival relies on such incredibly thin margins, diagnosing exactly how these near misses happened gives us our best, and perhaps only, working blueprint for keeping civilization intact. We have to start with systemic mistakes. These are specific instances where the massive mechanical and digital architectures built to keep us safe actively broke down and accelerated the danger. In 1961, a B-52 bomber broke apart in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina. It dropped two 3.8 megaton nuclear bombs directly onto American soil. Physical weapon systems are heavy, highly complex, and entirely prone to mechanical failure. Military engineers rely on fail-safe redundancy, building multiple, independent safety switches into a single bomb. In North Carolina, 3 out of the 4 safety mechanisms on one of those falling bombs failed. A single, simple, low-voltage switch was the only thing that prevented a multi-megaton detonation. To counter the physical threats, the Cold War powers built massive digital early warning networks. They networked radar arrays and satellites into central computers to automate threat detection, creating entirely new ways for the system to fail. In September 1983, sirens began screaming inside a Soviet bunker. The automated satellite system reported with highest confidence that the United States had just launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles directly at the Soviet Union. This flowchart shows the automated logic. Computers detect a flash, confirm trajectory, and prompt the officer to retaliate. But the duty officer guessed 5 missiles was too small for a first strike. He broke protocol, declared a malfunction, and blocked the launch command. That officer was Stanislav Petrov. He was correct. The satellite had been confused by high-altitude sunlight reflecting off clouds. No machine, no matter how redundant, is flawless. History demonstrates that human intuition and the willingness to disobey a machine is the only truly reliable failsafe we have ever produced. Mechanical glitches are terrifying, but they are localized. The broader, more pervasive threat to human survival is psychological. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, political posturing pushed both the United States and the Soviet Union to maximum military readiness. This tactic, brinkmanship, uses the absolute threat of war to force a diplomatic outcome. The civilian population absorbed this standoff directly. People sat on public beaches in Florida watching active, loaded missile batteries pointing across the water, waiting for a single miscommunication to trigger World War III. This cyclical flowchart visualizes the resulting paranoia feedback loop. When one nation mobilizes its defenses out of caution, the opposing nation interprets that defense as preparation for an attack, forcing them to mobilize in response. The cycle constantly accelerates. Once fear fully saturates a command structure, strategic logic flips. If you genuinely believe your enemy is going to wipe you out tomorrow, launching a preemptive first strike today begins to look like the most rational survival strategy available. This exact psychology drove the biological weapons race of the 1980s. Nations spent billions weaponizing anthrax and smallpox, not because they wanted to use them, but purely out of terror over what the other side might be engineering in secret. Fear guarantees escalation. It takes standard diplomatic friction and mutates it into a race toward the bottom, bypassing every logical safeguard governments put in place. And if this video made you realize how close humanity came to disappearing multiple times, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Because somewhere between all the fear, mistakes, and near apocalypses, there's one important lesson. The more people understand history, the better chance humanity has of not repeating it. The world is still spinning, and making sure it stays that way is entirely in our